Acknowledging that we will be having a couple of breakout sessions, so I'm not quite sure how the recording needs to be paused or whatnot for that.
Right.
Great, okay. So back to the acknowledgement of risk form, you'll find that on our website, and at the end of this, these slides, you'll see a link to the page that talks about recommendations for safe virtual programming. You'll find a link to the AOR there. And so we have, in consultation with the risk management department, Becky Bullock, we adapted the current version and just want to share the specific statement in this adapted AOR. It's really honing in on, you know, the risks of virtual programming as opposed to the risks that might come up with an in-person programming. So, you know, running the whole gamut. Of course, nobody is planning for this. Nobody hopes that that any of these things are going to happen, but we do just want parents and guardians to have the same expectations of, you know, to the extent that we can control it. Of course, we will prevent all of these horrible things from happening, but we do want everybody to be informed and acknowledging that, you know, that youth may be faced with a Zoom bomb incident or other types of unfortunate situations. So incorporating that is important. Just want to address a couple of other specific fields that are a part of the AOR form. It's helpful if you can describe the technologies that you're being used. It's, you know, it's important not to assume that parents or guardians know exactly what purpose a particular product is for. So naming, you know, that you will be using Zoom, for example, for hosting your live sessions, or you're going to be using Google Drive for storage of course materials, that type of thing. Is, again, part of helping families be able to acknowledge risk with all the information that they should have when they're doing so. The other field that's a little different than the typical acknowledgement of risk form is listing the types of virtual activities you will be undertaking. And this is, again, really just educating families about the way that you're using your technologies. And if you think about it from kind of a safety orientation, really this is getting at, you know, how is my child, for example, going to be interfacing with these technologies? What does that look like in practice during this program? So the examples I share are, you know, having live online group video sessions or use of chat. You know, there are certain risks inherent in different ways that we're using the technology. So making sure we're just letting, again, parents and guardians know, again, erasing the assumptions they might make so that they're, you know, fully informed. I also want to welcome folks to think about what examples might apply to your circumstances based on the products you're using or the virtual activities that you're going to be doing. I'm just sharing a few simple, brief, obvious, common examples, but I'm sure that many of you are using technologies in really creative ways. So just encourage you to kind of think through all of that and try to be as communicative as possible in your AOR forms. We have fillable PDFs for these AOR forms. It is fine to use them electronically. You would keep the AOR forms in the same way that you do any records, so follow the same record retention schedules and so on. I'll just pause for a sec in case there are any burning questions about the AORs. Don't see any at the moment. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Oh, and I do want to mention we are also, as we speak, getting this form and our other form that will in the future be available for in-person programming translated into Spanish. So we'll have Spanish language versions of these forms for the first time. So moving on to talking about communicating expectations. You all hopefully have had a chance to see the conduct code examples that we have, but I just want to point out that we do have adapted customized conduct codes for participants that include some specific language related to online behaviors that may, you know, prompt corrective action during a program. So first of all, let me back up and address the first bullet on this slide. really it's important to manage expectations at the point where parents are applying or registering for your program, or youth are applying or registering for your program. So again, a good description of your program that discusses what your program is and what it isn't going to be, especially as it's, as a virtual program, there are certain things you can and can't achieve through virtual, interactions. But as part of the application and registration, that's the point in time when you really want to incorporate your conduct expectations, also technology expectations and what would need to be required. If you're able to offer support for anyone to test their technology, or say you have a goal that you have an inclusive program, but if participants don't have access to hardware, maybe you're able to provide hardware for people to participate. So any of that, is where you want to communicate that at the very beginning. And then focusing in again on conduct so that we have, everybody starting out on the same level of expectation. The couple of examples here I have to share are just, again, what you'll find. I think this is the teenage. We have an elementary age youth participant conduct code and a teen older youth conduct code. I think this is the example out of the older youth conduct code. But we've just added, more language. So the highlighted language, this includes, so the following may result in being dismissed from the program: bullying, harassing or using derogatory language towards another person. Then we gave some examples. This includes sending, posting, or sharing negative, harmful, false, or mean content about others online. And that can manifest in a variety of ways. Can also include sharing personal or private information about someone else online. So making sure that these type of statements are incorporated into your conduct expectations with youth is important. And our conduct code includes both recognition and acknowledgement from the youth and also their parents, recognizing that the whole unit, we all have responsibilities in order to make this program successful. So again, early on, really reinforcing the parent's role in having a conversation with my child about online safety, and understanding that program staff are not able to monitor nor be responsible for what my child does online outside of program activities. So there's sort of a little bit of a, program reinforcing the limitations of our responsibility, but also encouraging them, the parent, to take a role in thinking about their child's safety.
And I think Rebecca has a question here about that. Oh, it's in the chat. It says that program staff are not responsible for what a participant does online outside of program activities. How about during program activities online?
I think, great question to clarify. We're not necessarily saying that we aren't responsible for behaviors that happen during program. Of course, we have limitations to, the whole point of the conduct code is you're setting expectations for behavior. So I believe there may be other language in the conduct code that talks about how we respond when behaviors that are not appropriate occur during the program. So really, I think implicitly we should take responsibility for behaviors that happen and addressing them. We can't prevent them, but as you'll see, I think the combination of the conduct code and the acknowledgement of risk is really setting the whole expectation of, okay, there are risks inherent in participating in the program, and we can't prevent these risks from, happening 100%. But we do take responsibility, and part of it is by setting expectations at the beginning. So sorry, Rebecca, I'm not sure if I'm totally answering that as clearly as I could.
This is Rebecca. I can clarify.
Sure.
I guess what I'm saying is, what you're saying is we can't totally prevent what participants are doing online, even during our program activities. But I kind of question about even being able to respond when we don't necessarily know, because there can be private chats going on. They can be screen sharing. They can be videotaping stuff on their phone that's happening online. They can be doing so many things that we would be able to observe if we were in person. And we wouldn't even know that these things were occurring. And so I guess that's why I was thrown off by that statement, because program staff are not able to monitor nor be responsible for what their child does online outside of program activities, but even during the program activities.
Yeah.
It's harder to be on top of it, I guess.
Yeah. I think there's a balance of what we need to put into place in our programs that we can control. So we're limiting, at least as a program, and that's part of, you know, I think what our expectations are is that you're incorporating enough security measures so that there's not, you know, if private chatting is happening between participants, it's not on the platform that you're offering, right? So, and any platform that you're monitoring and that you're responsible for hosting the program on, you need to be monitoring any chat that happens. So part of it is, again, it is on, the onus is on us to control to manage our own technology that we're offering. Other youth may be operating on informal ways with each other and communicating. That we definitely can't control. And I guess I think you can also clearly define program activities are what's hosted on using the technology that you're informing parents that you're using. So I think it's part of, again, controlling what you host and you're offering and setting those security measures, and then keeping your ears open for those things happening offline or outside of your purview.
And Tony just chimed in with, I think, a good reminder that if the host of a Zoom meeting can actually see all chat records, including those that are done privately between two participants, or and I think that may be something that, yeah, that you can't prevent necessarily people doing that, but one way that you can hopefully mitigate that is what Tony suggests, which is, you know, sharing that information ahead of time with your students or with your participants, right, to let them know that it may appear that it's a private chat, but it really isn't. And yeah, and then Sala has contributed also that you can turn off that option. So right, again, going back to Caroline's point about like controlling our own environments as well.
Definitely. Yeah, so definitely disabling private chat. I think that's to the extent that that doesn't completely undermine your ability to run your program. If it doesn't completely undermine your ability to run your program, just disable private chat. So that's not possible within your program. Yeah, all of those are really important. Great, and thanks for those suggestions. Okay, so so next, really what we want to kind of give you a chance to do is think about how prepared you are for those questions. Maybe you've already sort of, as you've been advertising about your programs, been entertaining some questions, and it's helped you be prepared. This is an iterative cycle, I think, for a lot of us as we're getting ready. There's a learning curve involved in running a full program online that most of us haven't really had to do thus far. So I want to share with you just a list of questions that actually I shared with parents at a webinar that was hosted by the Whole U a couple of weeks ago now. But what I was saying to parents is, you know, these are questions you can ask the program that's hosting, a youth program who's hosting a virtual program for your kid. You know, it's things to think about in terms of a parent's perspective around safety. So since I've cued some parents to be ready to ask these questions, you might want to be ready to answer these questions. I'll just go through them briefly, but then actually what we're going to have you do is break up into some small groups and just kind of talk through some of these questions and share with each other what questions you've been getting and how you've been able to kind of prepare yourself for answering these. So general questions, you know, are all interactions able to be monitored by program staff? So again, are you making sure that you are the eyes and the ears? I think a great answer is sort of Tony's example about, yes, we can monitor everything, including any private chats, because we can see the transcript. Are all interactions secure from outside interference? This is the, you know, Zoom bombing question. How do you prevent my kid from getting Zoom bombed? Is the technology appropriate for kids? You know, what was your thought process in choosing the technology you did, and as it relates to its appropriateness for kids? Hopefully you've done some thinking about that. Is the program limiting collection of personal information? So this is really about your privacy practices, and it just becomes a little bit more acute as parents are thinking about programs being recorded or things being transmitted through the internet. It just raises folks' awareness around privacy. How is information collected, protected? That you are collecting, how are you protecting that information? What are your security features, and what is your retention plan? And are both staff and participants held to a code of conduct specific to virtual interactions? So how are you preventing cyberbullying? How are you preventing, how are you managing behavior during your program? So what we'd like to do is, Laura shared the link to the document, so you can have these at the ready, because I'm going to change slides here, but you still can have that either via the PDF slide I sent, PDF I sent on email, or this link here that Laura sent. We're going to just take about 5 minutes and assign you to breakout rooms in groups of about 3 to 4, and give you a chance to just talk through those and think about for yourself, how have you prepared to be ready to run a safe program, but specifically in the context of, say, if parents or guardians or youth are asking you about how are you protecting us during this program. Yeah, we had an interesting discussion. It seems like there's a variety of questions coming up, maybe not necessarily safety related, maybe access related, other challenges. And so I think, there's ways based on what we know about our student population or our youth, and as we're getting to know them, we just keep the lines of communication open. But in general, hopefully we are going to learn a lot together this summer. So we're going to transition into talking about accessibility, and I will let Emily take that on.
Great, thanks, Caroline. So just another brief disclaimer, and my team are not experts on accessibility. We're really drawing on our UW partners who are the experts on this. And I mentioned them on this slide too as available for the UW community. So for designing accessible programs, we first want to focus on the concept of universal design. So really creating all presentations, content, and materials with the accessibility principles, so that individuals, we don't have to wait for them to make certain requests. Those features are already ingrained into the way that the program operates. So this, for example, includes including captioning on all videos you show, presenting information in ways that screen readers can access. So if you have a cool graphic or picture that's sharing some information, also having that information in text form underneath on the same page, and then also providing materials ahead of time in accessible formats. So these are only some examples of many, but integrating these and the others into your program really takes the onus off that one individual who is having to say, hey, can you put on captions, in every presentation they're a part of. So there are some really great resources, like I mentioned before, from the UW community available on how to make your content more accessible. So I list a couple here, but there are many. So Do It, I found this really helpful. They have 20 tips for offering accessible online programming. And then UW IT has a lot on accessibility as far as online and web content. And they have this checklist and tutorial that I've linked here that I found really helpful. It introduces the principles and then also gives some really detailed information about how to implement them. So if they're saying to do a certain thing on your website, they also provide sample HTML code so that you can really implement them. And then next slide. And then, so while universal design should be your starting point, for designing accessible programming, you also want to make sure that you're soliciting and responding to any accommodation requests that you're getting from your participants. So as Caroline mentioned, the AOR form template that we have, it has a section on the bottom about like accommodations, and incorporating that information into a form like the AOR that all participants get is and must be returned by all participants is a really good way to make sure that everybody is reached and is aware of their right to receive accommodations. And then it's also important to consider timing. So you want to give your team enough time to meet requests, and this may involve making changes based on these accommodations. So the DSO, so the UW Disability Service Office, they request 10 days of lead time when receiving requests for accommodations. So you might want to consider requesting to hear back from your participants a couple weeks before the start of your program, just to give your team time to implement those. So just as with virtual programming being different in many ways from in-person programming, it also might differ in accommodation requests. So that might mean that you're getting, a similar request you would be getting for an in-person program. You just need to figure out how to translate that online, or it might be a totally new request that you're getting just because the program is virtual. So you want to take, hopefully you have a couple weeks of lead time that you've planned in to familiarize yourself with what's being asked if it's something new to your team, and making sure that you have the resources to honor that request, because it's important to honor all the requests for accommodations that you're getting. And then finally, our UW DSO office is there as a resource. You can reach out to them if you have a request you're not sure how to accommodate, or you just want to consult with them. They provide sample language on their website as well, so you can implement that in your forms and all of that. And then they also, it's important to note, they do need to be consulted if you're considering saying no to a request. And their website, the UW DSO website, has their contact information, email, phone number, so you can get a hold of them.
And then one thing just to add that Susie from Do It has contributed is that there's a captioning service through Accessible Technology Services and like document remediation service. And so Susie's going to share that resource with us, and we can forward that on to you all as a particular point of connection. And then you're going to transition over to me, but I first have to let my cat out of the room before he scrapes my door. What's left of my door, at least. Okay, I'm back. So next we want to talk a little bit about staff screening and supervision. So how are you structuring your program supervision structure to ensure that you're upholding the same safety protocols and precautions that we would expect in person programs? And so that starts with thinking about the screening and selection and training of your staff. So as we've talked about, online programming is not exactly the same as in person. And so using new technologies may require new skills, right? Translating your program activities into a virtual format may mean that you need to learn new technologies, different skills. And so you really need to be thinking about who your staff are and whether they're adequately prepared to do those new protocols or implement those new processes that you're creating in your translation or your pivot to an online format. So thinking about how do you either assess your current staff for those skills, or if you're in the position of hiring new folks, how would you consider what those skills are and assess candidates for those skills? And then how do you fill the gaps, right? I think all of us are learning that Zoom has a lot of intricacies, for example, and so having some training on Zoom or training on facilitating conversations in a virtual space versus an in-person space, making sure that you're providing that content for your staff so that they're ready to respond as needed. And then when it comes to supervising staff in this kind of setting is obviously really different than being able to have FaceTime with your staff. So thinking back to how you're communicating risks to parents and participants, you also want to be sure that you're considering how you're going to communicate and enforce your expectations for your staff. And one of the tools that we have for that is an addendum to the Standard University Standards for Interacting with Youth, which is our Authorized Personnel Conduct Code. And this virtual interactions addendum specifically calls out how virtual interactions are a little bit different and how you might be holding folks accountable to these standards in this new setting. So we encourage you to use that and dependent on the technologies that you're using, potentially add to and amend that addendum with your particular program expectations as well. And the other thing is to think about how are you identifying and then telling your staff about the ways that you're going to be providing them supportive or corrective supervision. I think sometimes it's, again, easier to supervise staff when you see them doing their work in an in-person setting, but you need to be available to them and having clear lines of communication about how you're going to continue to supervise and support them through online formats as well. So making sure that ahead of time you're thinking about that, putting those structures into place, and then communicating those expectations to your staff through the code of conduct or other communications as you train and onboard them. So next slide. So this is about supervision of participants. So as well as supervising your staff, obviously an online program doesn't diminish your responsibility to supervise the participants as well. And so it's important to remember that your responsibility is to supervise all of the program spaces. So going back to our conversation earlier about maintaining that sense of supervision and control and oversight, this is really important that you think holistically about what your program spaces are online as well. So thinking about email communications as part of your program space, chat boxes as part of your program space, Zoom videos, etc., as part of your program spaces, and making sure that you're putting in place as many lines of oversight and protection as you can. And this really, I think, requires a shift in thinking about how you plan your activities. So a really obvious example that I think we're probably all familiar with by this point is breakout rooms in Zoom. It's a lot harder to supervise 10 breakout rooms as one person than it is to supervise 10 breakout clusters in a single classroom on campus, right? That's a lot easier to supervise both your staff and the participants among a small team if you're in person in one room. But navigating between breakout rooms is a lot more complicated and challenging. So you need to think proactively about the number of staff that are required to provide that kind of supervision in breakout rooms in Zoom, for instance. And so a question just to pose to you all briefly is, what are some of the ways that you are thinking about providing open lines of communication and trying to build community among your program staff and youth, knowing that there is a digital divide, right? It is a hard hurdle to overcome. So thinking proactively about how might you open yourself to youth and make sure that your program space is inviting and welcoming them to come in and build community while you're still maintaining those safety precautions. So maybe just 2 or 3 volunteers could share anything that they're thinking about doing or any strategies that they've heard, and feel free to just unmute yourself or share it in the chat box. I know there's a brilliant idea out there just waiting to be heard. Well, I'll put, Cher had left the room already, but she shared at one of our previous meetings that they do a water cooler Zoom hangout. So it's available with no formal program agenda, but just an opportunity for people to come together and sort of mix. And I think they have some sort of prompt that they use to sort of get conversation going. Lisa Peterson has added in the chat box that they also have a weekly Zoom meeting with all of their staff, right? So having a formal kind of check-in process, I think is important. I think to give you a little insight into our office, Caroline and Emily and I work in 2 rooms that are right next to each other in Mary Gates, and there's a lot of running back and forth and popping in to ask each other questions, and that's really hard to do in this setting. And so having ways of connecting still every day, I think, is really important. So Leslie's contributed office hours, right? So for parents and staff, just an open, you don't have to have an appointment, drop in and ask us your questions. Those are all really good ways of making yourself available. And whether people take advantage of it or not, that's always the challenge with office hours from faculty, right? But it sends a message that you're available that is really important. And Leela, I love it. They've added a Slack group that has an LOL channel just for sharing fun stuff. I think that's really important. My partner's work has a cats channel that I am a huge fan of. So finding those ways to just be people as well, right? That you do naturally in person, but are maybe harder to translate to online. So thanks for that. Okay, next slide. So just wanted to give an example of these things that we've been talking about in one platform, so using Zoom. So for example, we talked a little bit about new skills that might be required. Zoom has a lot of technical intricacies. So that's a new skill, a new platform that I never, I never thought I'd be spending so much time with. But Zoom is also one of these platforms that is a really interesting combination of skills, because it is using the technical features of Zoom, but it's also the interpersonal skills of facilitating conversation in this platform. So that's a unique skill that maybe you want to give your staff some practice in your training. Potential topics for training, an overview of the very deep security settings available and which ones might actually be the best fit for your programs. I would recommend that you set standards and decide among your staff, how are we going to structure our Zoom sessions and what settings are we going to put in place so that those are standard across all your interactions. We are or we're not going to allow chat. We are or we're not going to have a waiting room, whatever it is, so that you know that those protections are uniform across all your interactions. Another training topic that I think is really important is responding to intruders or inappropriate events. What happens if Zoom bombing happens? What are you going to do? And are your staff equipped to respond? I know that we talked a little bit about this in one of our summer programs, and somebody who had unfortunately been Zoom bombed talked about then going through a scenario afterwards where it was like, how fast can I shut down a meeting, and becoming really adept at knowing I can click on that leave button, that close the meeting button in 2 seconds, so that I'm really prepared at the drop of a hat to shut down a meeting and respond appropriately. Thinking again about supervision, we've talked a fair amount about that. And then just lastly, to speak a little bit to staff responsibilities and tasks. Zoom, I think, really requires this. So Caroline, Emily, and I are all co-hosts of this meeting so that we can all have some level of control and response, right? So somebody is doing breakout rooms, somebody's monitoring the chat, and then somebody's available to just assist. So really thinking about your staff as an asset and trying to assign them responsibilities so that you can, again, just be really responsive and prepared, and everyone knows what their role is and how they're going to assist in ensuring that safety and the important delivery of the content that you're trying to convey. So then last, before we transition into scenarios, we want to touch a little bit on reporting abuse, neglect, and behaviors of concern. So this is, again, something that doesn't change just because we've pivoted to online. We still have an obligation to be aware of and keeping an eye out for any signs of suspected abuse or neglect. And we also are upholding the code of conduct, the standards for interacting with youth. And any violations of those standards are considered behaviors of concern. So we have a continuum that we can link to that outlines those behaviors of concern, but those are really what we call the violations of the code of conduct. And that means violations of the standard code of conduct or the online addendum that you'll be using with your staff. And so that obligation to report and be mindful of those and aware of those doesn't change, but how those things might appear may change. It may be different because of online formats. So for example, it may be harder to look for signs of abuse or neglect because you don't have that in-person contact. It might be harder to gauge whether a youth is withdrawing, which may be a sign of abuse or neglect. You may not be able to see physical signs of abuse or self-harm. And so figuring out ways to be aware of and keeping your finger on that pulse are really important. Similarly, behaviors of concern may look differently in person than they would in this online setting. And so, for example, it may be harder to monitor one-on-one interactions. It may be harder to know if your staff are emailing with youth than it would be to see if they're just pulling them aside at lunch consistently. So finding ways to, again, be aware of that and enforcing the code of conduct and following up on any reports. Another one, I've heard horrible news reports of the number of Americans that are day drinking at their jobs. And while I would assume that no youth program personnel would do that, thinking about the level of oversight that you have of your staff's behavior while they're working from their home, it is different, right? So figuring out ways to really be keeping those lines of communication open, making sure that you're following up and supervising is really, really important, because we have to, I think, be more communicative than we would if we were in person, because online kind of strips away some of that connection that we might have. So I was going to have another little discussion prompt about ways that you might reach out to a youth if you do have a concern. But I think that we want to cruise ahead with our scenarios just so that you have enough time to do that. So we have 4 scenarios, and Emily's gonna again put us into breakout rooms, and the scenarios themselves and the questions for discussion are in that same document that we linked to before. And so I think we'll divide into 4 rooms, and the room number that you're assigned will be the number of the scenario that you should go to in that document. And I will put the document link in there again in case we don't have it. And maybe we'll do about 6 minutes together or in the breakout rooms, and then come back and try to do a really brief rundown as a group. So maybe nominate one person from your breakout group to share one really important consideration that you think everybody should know. So don't have to go through the whole rundown of the scenario, but just one really important tidbit or takeaway that you all decided on. So we'll come back together at 11:55. So I realized that I'm a terrible example because my group did not nominate someone to share a tidbit. So group 2 is off the hook, but group 1, can somebody from group 1 share maybe a tidbit or a thought that they had about this scenario of a counselor inadvertently bailing on a breakout room, and so another counselor having to supervise it solo, which is not recommended? Anybody from group 1?
We didn't nominate, but I'll just say briefly, because I wish we'd had a little more time to discuss this. But what we did talk about is there should be a protocol that the staff member who ended up being solo needs to nominate, or excuse me, needs to communicate with staff that, you know, they have been left on their own, obviously. And then Tammy from Do It had a couple of great things to bring up, which is, you know, even if you plan for having 2 people on the call, connectivity issues might cause someone to drop off. So her suggestion was, you know, plan to have 3 staff members on the call if possible. There was another suggestion to have bigger breakout groups rather than smaller, so you can have more staffing, and then having someone assigned to just be dropping in on each of the breakout rooms and just making sure that everything's going okay. But we didn't really have time to discuss what to do now that we know this has happened.
Well, we can pass it. Well, you all have this document, but maybe some of these scenarios are a good thing for your staff training too, to talk about how you as a team might troubleshoot. So scenario 2, this is mine, and we didn't nominate and talk about it. Do any of my compatriots want to speak up on anything that we shared?
This is Laura Beth. I can say that one of the things that it just made me think of as being really important is having a community agreement, having some kind of document to fall back on in terms of what the participants have agreed to in terms of their treatment and associations with each other.
Right. Yeah, so having that code of conduct, and then that virtual addendum that we have for both participants and for staff. Yeah, having something to point to that clearly outlines repercussions if somebody is doing something like cyberbullying. Absolutely. Okay, group 3, the fire, the robotics fire.
I guess that's me. We noted that the 12-year-old was relevant because it's a different set of rules and they wouldn't be able to use Canvas or Zoom. So the question came up is how would they be being supervised was one thing. We thought that how you respond to this would kind of depend on what you'd sent out already. Hopefully you had put something in the agreement that the parents signed that kind of told them that they'd be doing some hands-on stuff and that it would be independent and that they would be working on their own and then need supervision during that time, and that, you know, because they were working independently on their own schedule, that staff couldn't supervise them. So if that was in place, then it would be a matter of kind of, first off, figuring out what went wrong, you know, because obviously something went wrong. But then kind of working with the parents and families to understand, to see if they understood things, or if, you know, maybe they hadn't signed it or something, and to, you know, first fix it and then try and de-escalate it, especially since no one had gotten hurt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm sensing a theme to our scenarios here, that communication ahead of time, really, really important. What is it? A pint of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or something like that. Okay, so last but not least, group 4, with a potentially concerning appreciation for a staff member that sort of intimates some inside jokes, some affection, maybe some red flags here. Anybody from group 4?
This is Dina. We fired everybody. Just kidding. So one of the things that I always think about is trying to step back and look at the whole picture. And so we talked about, what are some things that we don't know. And so we share the idea that, maybe the staff member, usually when we hire people to work with the type of students that we work with, possibly are from the same area, possibly family members, third cousins. And so when we read this, we were thinking, what if there is a relationship between the student and the staff member that we're not aware of? Were they at some type of event this weekend? And so the student made this comment, just kind of relating to what had happened in this weekend or the night before. So we were really trying to figure out where this could have came from, if it wasn't something they did together as a program. Also, definitely talking to the staff member about this and kind of having a conversation in regards to what is allowed and not allowed in these types of platforms when it comes to giving out shout outs to our students and our staff members. So one of the things we could do is probably model how we do that. And here I'll go first to show you what, and really be technical about, hey, we're going to give kudos to students who did this or completed this, and be more specific and kind of keeping it one way.
Yeah, great. And I think that it's important to bring up that potential for outside relationships. And one of the things that we call out in our code of conduct is that those kinds of things should be disclosed ahead of the program, so that staff and students or participants who have that kind of outside of the program relationship, that kind of thing is known, so that it is taken into context when you might see something like this that sort of points to a closer relationship. So yeah, doing some more investigation and understanding of the situation, always really important. And again, yeah, making sure that you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to these ways that are really good ways of connecting to youth and showing appreciation. Okay, so we're over time. So much more to talk about. Really appreciate all your good thoughts. We're gonna share out well, you already have these slides. They're already shared out. But here are some links that are kind of key resources. So we do have a page on our website that is virtual programming recommendations. So sort of a step-by-step of what we've covered today with a lot of resources to support. We also have a page specific to using Zoom if you're using Zoom with over 13-year-olds. And then on our documents, tools, and templates page, we have all of our acknowledgement of risk forms, including the ones for virtual programs, and our codes of conduct for both participants and staff alike. And you can see those there at the bottom. And then the last link is one from commonsense.org. And this is a resource that that shared those questions that Caroline shared earlier. And they have lots of really good resources for helping educators use online platforms safely. So a good resource there as well. So I volunteered to hang out and answer any questions if folks have them. I don't have to run off, but want to be respectful of your time as well, and just say a big thank you to you for joining us and for all the work that you're doing to create safe engagements under very unusual circumstances and with really quick turnaround. Just really, really appreciate it, and know that the youth and families that you're serving appreciate having these really valuable engagements this summer, even if they don't look quite the way that we thought they were going to.